Good evening, everyone. We begin by acknowledging that the Weisman Art Museum is located on the traditional and contemporary land of the Dakota people. We aspire to honor and respect the Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, by incorporating Indigenous knowledge in our work and establishing meaningful reciprocal relationships with the carriers of Indigenous knowledge and with communities. I'm Katie Covey-Spanier, the Director of Programming and Student Engagement at the Weisman Art Museum. Tonight's program features multidisciplinary artist and community organizer Seitu Jones in conversation with award-winning poet, McKnight Presidential Fellow, and Associate Professor of Creative Writing and English at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, Douglas Kearney. The two are brought into conversation on the occasion of Seitu's newest commission from the University of Minnesota's Public Art Program, administered by Weisman Public Art Curator Craig Amundsen. This site-specific work will be installed in July at Pillsbury Hall, home of the English Department Creative Writing Program and the Liberal Arts Engagement Hub at the University of Minnesota. Seitu's work joins the collection of more than 36 public artworks installed throughout the University of Minnesota campus. The public art collection aims to build a sense of community and give public spaces meaningful identity, inspiring observers to think about their world differently. To learn more about the Weisman's Public Art Program, visit wam.umn.edu. As we begin the program, I would like to thank the voters of Minnesota for supporting the operational budget of our museum through funds from the Minnesota State Arts Board. And thank you to Wells Fargo Foundation Minnesota also for supporting our operational budget. I'm grateful to my colleagues at the Weisman Art Museum for helping to make this event happen this evening. Throughout our conversation, we invite you to submit your questions and thoughts to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll respond to your question in the Q&A period after the conversation. You can upvote the questions you're interested in by clicking the like button, and the questions with more votes will rise to the top of the queue. We will be recording tonight's event and it will be posted to the Weisman's YouTube channel. To ensure the event remains accessible to all, we're incorporating live captioning and ASL video interpreters so all may participate. During a screen share, the ASL video if it's too small or too large, you can drag the vertical divider left or right to increase or decrease the size of the shared content in the video feeds. Live captioning is an option you can select to have visible. To turn on live captioning, select Show Subtitles in the drop-down menu under the Live Transcription tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our artists this evening, Douglas Kearney and Seitu Jones. Douglas Kearney has published 7 books, including Show, Wave Books 2021, which Ken Chen of NPR writes, Kearney's Prosody is Miraculous, the award-winning poetry collection Buck Studies, Offense Books 2016, Libretti, Someone Took They Tongues, Subito 2016, and Criticism, Mess and Mess and Noemi Press 2015. Wire magazine calls Fodder, a live album featuring Kearney and frequent collaborator Val Inc. brilliant. And Whiting Writers and Foundation for Contemporary Arts, Cy Twombly awardee with residencies and fellowships from Cave Canem, the Rauschenberg Foundation, and others. Kearney is a McKnight Presidential Fellow and Associate Professor of Creative Writing and English at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Born in Brooklyn, raised in Altona, California, he lives in St. Paul with his family. And Seitu Ken Jones, a multidisciplinary artist, advocate, and maker based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Working between the arts and public spheres, Jones channels the spirit of radical social movements into experiences that foster critical conversations and nurture more just and vibrant communities from the soil up. He is recognized as a dynamic collaborator and a creative force for civic engagement. And now I'd like to welcome Seitu and Douglas to the screen.
Hey.
Hey, how you doing, Seitu?
All right, how's it going, Douglas?
Man, it's going all right.
you know. Just maintaining, as they say.
Earlier, right before this thing began, first I want to give a big shout out to all the folks who are out there. And I was asking Katie, she asked me if I had any questions about this. And the big question is like, why on a nice night like this would you all want to be inside listening to this stuff?
It puts an inordinate amount of pressure on us, doesn't it, Seitu?
No joke. Yeah, we really have to entertain.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then, perhaps on the subject of entertainment, this is actually the first question I want to ask you. What are you listening to these days?
Oh man, I am listening to a little bit of everybody. I'm actually been going back in time and listening to some old Hugh Masekela. I just downloaded a bunch of Hugh Masekela stuff. And my taste in music really evolved and had this kind of foundation in the late 60s, early 70s. One of the nicest presents that I received so far from my kids for Father's Day was them retweeting something that somebody had said about the music that their father played in the house and how they may have hated it at the time, but how fundamental it is to the work that they listen to now. And so my kids sent me like these lists of stuff that they had to listen to: Earth, Wind and Fire, Miles Davis, all of these folks that I played in the house. And sometimes I find myself going back in time to do that. But I've also been listening to a lot of Robert Glasper and picking up stuff that he's done with Lamar Kendricks, with Jill Scott. I mean, he's played all over the place. Just did the soundtrack for the movie Photograph. That was fantastic. Anyway, so yeah, I listened to a little bit of everything, man. At this time. So yeah, I don't know if that was too long of an answer. But,
no, like I don't really have a timer.
The work, it's the music I listen to, that all of that helped form when I say it was foundational, it really helped form the philosophic foundation of my work, and it helped kind of undergird my life, not just providing a soundtrack to my career as an artist, but also helping guide me in different ways. Listen to the music. It's always on in my studio. I have to have good sound, and if I weren't talking to you right now in this little place, I'd have it going.
Right. Well, no, I mean, I think that idea around the observation about it providing a foundation and a mode of approach. I mean,
right. That's right.
And even discussing how the music that you played, seen through this tweet, right, impacts your, is around this kind of idea of what remains, what is passed down, how we influence, and how we nourish, right? This
Absolutely.
Idea.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and right on there. And when you said nourish, I go back to what's the brother's name who was one of now I got a mental block on this brother's name. Who was a speechwriter for MLK, another public theologian. Sterling, God, what was his name? But one of the things that he said and it just hung with me for so long. And I'll probably think of his name around 9 o'clock tonight, long after this thing. But one of the things that he said that just hung with me and burned in my head was that stories nourish us, and music also nourishes us. One of the things that we've seen, and I was just talking today, telling my wife about the very first time I heard Marvin Gaye's What's Going On here in the 50th year. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I can remember my brother, Craig Taylor, coming home to this apartment that we shared and playing that album. And we listened to it over and over and over. And it was a guide for us. It was something that we could launch on. But in talking about music again, and that influence back and forth, I have always wanted to be a musician. I'm outing myself right now.
Okay. And, you heard it here, folks.
And I mean, just a few weeks ago, I was talking about an award I won because they gathered all the African-American males who won this award, presented by the Ordway Theater downtown. It's named after Sally Ordway, and they're called the Sally Awards. And here I was on there with the founders of Walker West Music Academy, with the founder, and big shout out on the 50th anniversary of Sounds of Blackness, on there with the leader of Sounds of Blackness, Gary Hines. Lou Bellamy was an award winner. But when I won this award, and a little bit of cash comes with it, I won the award. But I was nominated by the winner the previous year, who was Gary Hines. I had asked Lou Bellamy, who hadn't won yet, to do this presentation for me. Lou Bellamy, one of the founders of Penumbra Theater. And then with the money that I received, I bought a bass and took bass lessons at Walker West.
Oh, wow.
So it was like all the stuff that was sewn together. But saying all that to say is that there are many interdisciplinary artists that function in this sphere of this African, or actually this Afro-Atlantic tradition. And part of that, and one of the things that runs through music, is the spirit of improvisation.
Yes.
And that is one of the things that I also use in my work. Even though sometimes my work might be very literal, I mean, it still operates within that grand African tradition of improvising.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I mean, something that you were talking about with the bands and the groups you were citing, is this, there's oftentimes an aspect of improvisation with these groups, right, and collaboration. And I'm curious about how you think about your relationship to the materials, especially when you're doing sculpture. Does that feel collaborative? Are you listening, for lack of a better way of putting it, to what the materials are telling you? Like that process. Because I'm thinking of Thaddeus Mosley, the sculptor out of Pittsburgh. And that's something that, he kind of talks about when he's working with the wood, that it makes certain things possible. And at that level, you're collaborating more than, well, you could be collaborating more than acting upon.
Right.
So I wonder does that resonate?
Oh, yes. I mean, that rings a big bell with me. Oh, yeah. And it actually even recalls one of the lines of our great Black philosopher, Richard Pryor.
Yes.
And I'm not even going to talk about what he was referring to, but he said, "It's talking to you, baby." And so the material itself will talk to me. I'm working right now as we speak on a wood sculpture. And I have to find my way with it. I have to look at it, feel it for a while, and it's going to tell you like which way it's going to go. And you can't fight it. I mean, it's like in the way that we have approached art and science and almost everything else in the Western world is by control and domination. And among indigenous cultures, whether here in what we now call North America, or in Africa or South America, you know, folks realize that we can't control or dominate the land, but we can work with it and manage it to a particular point. And that's what I try and build even into the work I do. You know, even jumping ahead, going into Pillsbury Hall during construction, or actually during demolition last year, the building was talking to me. It's talking to you, baby. And one of the things it said was to use the materials that are there. And so during demolition, they removed a number of joists, these large, really, you know, now when we say I'm going to get a 2x4, it's not really 2 inches by 4 inches. But when the building was built in the 1890s on the University of Minnesota's campus, it was actually the full width 2x. And some of them were 2x12s and 2x14s, this old lumber. And this old lumber that was in the building that they were removing, just sitting in piles. And so it was talking to me. So we ended up repurposing that lumber for the sculptures that are going to be back inside the building. So the wood, and another little side about that wood is probably old growth timber. You know, that was near the end, and when that building was built, it was near the end of the decimation of the white pine forest that covered where we are right now. You know, the land that we were on was occupied by the Dakota and their ancestors, but it was that oak savanna that we describe and that white pine lumber. And some of those trees we've estimated in working with the fabricators, the folks who are working with me on fabricating, constructing, and installing this thing, or probably planted, or not planted, but seeded themselves in the 1700s. You know, so there's this link that goes all the way back. And this is also part of what I do, is mine a particular site for its cultural references, for its social references, for, you know, any number of things, and put that back in. So that was another long answer there.
No, that's what people are here to hear you. I mean, but that I'm really glad about what you said about putting it back. You know, because there's the mining and there's this sort of extractive process of like taking things away and then, you know, taking them away and carrying them off to wherever they go end up.
Right.
And so with this, there is reaching in and uncovering, in the case literally of with the wood from from Pillsbury, there's a kind of an uncovering or recovering of it and making it plain and making it present. And I guess I wanted to talk about that in relationship to the concept of erasure. You know, because on the one level, the tree hewn becomes erased, and then it takes on this new form. But then that, in the name of progress or advancement, you know, becomes erased as well. And so I want to think a little bit about erasure and your work's relationship to erasure, your work's relationship to presencing, as something that I find really fascinating.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. You know, and I'm going to answer this maybe a couple different ways and maybe not directly. Mm-hmm. Right now, as we speak, you visited my studio space, which is about a mile away from where I am seated right now. Right now, we are in my little office slash, and I should say temporary, my little temporary office slash archive. So what you see behind me in the flat files and the sculpture, the furniture, the stuff on the wall there, all of that is work that I've created over decades. And I have been focused and actually I'm plotting and planning the next season of my life. And what that means. And so a lot of that is thinking about my legacy and what I'm going to leave behind personally. And so I want to control that legacy. And for a number of reasons. You mentioned erasure. Mm-hmm. I am here on Selby and Dale in St. Paul, and the old Rondo community and what we used to call even Selby Dale area. And right on the corner of Selby and Victoria was a cultural institution founded in the late 60s, early 70s called Inner City Youth League. And it really helped shape me. It was one of these things, one of these mini institutions that came out of this Black cultural revolution. It was part of the Black arts movement. I mean, we didn't know what to call it then. I mean, didn't even have a name for it at that time, although there were folks that were calling it the Black arts movement at that time. We were just swept up in this rich mix of politics, culture, music, again, was all a part of that. But, and while I have this academic training behind me, I learned more at Inner City Youth League from listening to artists argue about the role of African-American artists from a variety of perspectives. And many of those artists, many of my peers, many of the folks that came before me, I can mention, but folks won't recognize their names. And I have been really concerned about their legacy and how do we remember and acknowledge those folks that came before. Unfortunately, while they haven't been erased from my mind, they have been erased from our collective memory. And so how can we establish a process, a template, a system that will acknowledge other African-American artists, my peers who are still around, or the folks who are following us. You know, we don't like to think about what's going to happen to us after we go, but we need to begin to plot and plan that. We need to do estate planning, wills, and even getting to the point where we compile our work and start to catalog our work. So I'm working with a team of African-American archivists and historians that are helping me decide what to keep, what not to keep, and where all that stuff is going to go.
Right.
You know, so like I am really trying to think about that legacy. Now, kind of back to the question that you asked about the piece. In pieces, it was really the artwork itself that once again was talking to me and saying, you know, you've created this work on these streetscapes all over. Right. But how will folks know who did it? and more importantly to me, and that's my vanity speaking, I want to be remembered, but more importantly is to why he did that, who he worked with, and why, and we need to credit all those folks. How do we do that? So even with this work in Pillsbury Hall, bringing this all back to Pillsbury Hall, we mind the legacy and the history of that building that was built as a science building, primarily for the earth sciences. It was the home of geology. And I mean, when I was on campus there 50 years ago, that's what was happening there in that building. But, I had also gotten a few cues from the University of Minnesota's archivist. And he had discovered, we asked him to do some digging on the building itself. One of the things I was concerned about was racial science and how that was taught. I mean, the whole philosophy where folks used pseudoscientific methods to measure the inferiority of people of color, with Black folks at the bottom. And that was something that was taught on campus. I was concerned it was taught there, but we couldn't find any history that some of the biggest advocates of that science taught there. They did teach at the university. That is a fact. That's a whole other story. but that was one of the things that that I was concerned about. Another thing, in bringing out the legacy of that building, we found out, with the work that I wanted to do with wood there, we found out that through the archivist that Pillsbury Hall was also the home of the University of Minnesota's wood shop. It was located there. So all of that was happening there. And then on the horrible, almost unthinkable side, there was a small museum there on campus. And one of the folks that was a part of that witnessed the execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato had donated part of the scaffolding to the University of Minnesota to view. Now, we couldn't find any evidence that it was actually viewed and what the university did with it. But this piece of lumber has been floating around in our horrible history for a long time. So this also with my work on the streetscape and with the work that we're doing in Pillsbury Hall, also represents a cleansing. It represents a way of, with words, with text, with art, with shape, and not with sound, but we would go on there too, as a way of making this building habitable. During the ceremony to dedicate this piece, I hope to be able to perform some ritual there, at least pouring libations for all the folks who came before. But, so I'm saying all that to say is that we literally dug deep in the history and legacy there, and are thinking of ways not to forget what happened, but to acknowledge what happened and hopefully point us in a direction that will be will be full of a lot more grace and equity.
That was beautifully said. Something that
I don't know, did I answer the question?
If you didn't, then we need to retcon the question. Because, you know, I mean, but this brings me to something that I've been thinking about, which is the sculptural object, you know, three-dimensional object in a space, as a presence in some way, you know, directly affects and impacts the movement of people through the space. And there are some, you know, depending upon, you know, a person's attitude towards the object, they might think of it as an interruption, or someone else might think about it as, you know, a kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, a kind of a resonant site. You know, I'm thinking about the language of the, you know, psychogeography, we call it ambiance, right? A specific sort of ambiance. And I guess my question for you is, in this project and in other projects, especially in spaces that, as you've talked about, which are, you know, US American and therefore contested, right? Because there's not a site you could find here in 2021 that doesn't have, you know, that isn't contested.
That's right.
And so how does a sculptural work or some other form of marking of land, like the shadow pieces, like how do those function as interventions in the lives of the many different people who are going to pass by? Now, we're going to talk more about like memory, but I guess what I'm thinking about is like when is it a speed bump? When is it a hurdle? When is it?
Oh yeah. No, I hear exactly what you're saying. You know, I have done a whole body of work in the pavement, in the streetscape. So if you go to St. Paul Farmers Market, and you'll see these etchings that are that are on the pavement, under the big, long roofs there. You'll see these pieces, you'll encounter these pieces. And this is a way for me to not just to bless the land, but to mark it as well, and to mark its use in a whole other kind of way. And so one of the things that I've done, I mean, that speed bump that you described, is wanting to create these pieces that are subtle, that are embedded in the pavement in a way that you may walk over them every day and may notice a little bit more, may see text. And here's a good point where I need to bring up my constant collaborator, especially over the last few years, Soini Guyton, who is a poet and my wife. Her work, and we laugh about this, has been published more in the streetscape than anywhere else. So she has her own guide that you need to follow. And so we've collaborated on a number of pieces, creating text that is running on and on. And I've worked with other poets as well too, but as a way of using text, words, design, art to weave a story, to nourish us in a different way. And every day you can get a little piece of that as you go through. So that's one side of it. And then over the last few years, I have been consciously creating cosmograms. You know, this Afro-Atlantic tradition of marking the land in a way to remember those folks who come before, and as a way of representing our cosmology, what we believe, what we see in the stars. And so right now, as we speak, I have designed a cosmogram that will be the playing surface for a piece that's being done at Pillsbury Hall Theater in South Minneapolis. A piece that's directed by Signe Heraday, and we're using half of the parking lot to create this cosmogram that will have these lifelines that go through it. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to come back to that.
Okay.
I designed a cosmogram that represents the lifeline of Philando Castile for the peace memorial that will be placed on Larpenteur, the site where he was murdered. And working with 10 by 10 landscape architectural firm, and really need to give a big shout out for Formula Architects, this African-American founded and led design firm that is the project manager for this piece, the primary designers. But my role was to integrate and to work with them and collaborate and integrate. Once again, talking about that band, talking about that music, that create this line that followed the life of Philando Castile, that's embedded in the pavement, that will mark the dawn, the light that comes across the dawn of his birthday. On July 16th, and then it will be crossed by the shadows and light on the sundown or sunset of his death. So going back to Pillsbury House, we just did this cosmogram that will mark the birth of Jamar Clark, who was murdered by the police, of Philando Castile, and of George Floyd. Pillsbury House is just a couple blocks away from the George Floyd Memorial right now, George Floyd Square. So, and I should say too, and I always, whenever I talk about cosmogram, have to give a big shout out to Houston Conwell, this African-American artist who passed, almost 15 years ago now, suddenly, about that time. But he had created these cosmograms. So if you go so that was a source of inspiration for me. So if you go into the Schomburg Research Center in Harlem, you'll see this cosmogram that Houston Conwell created that was inspired by one of Langston Hughes' poems. I've known rivers. And so he's got these 4 rivers that cross the lifeline of Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes's ashes are interred under that. So that gives it even more power. So all of that to say, these things that are written in the ground, that are on the ground, using light as some kind of way, and I should come back to that too, because this collaboration with Soyini and with Takumba Aiken, who I need to give a big shout out to, has been one of my dearest friends and one of my constant collaborators for the last almost 50 years. But we've collaborated on this thing that we call shadow spirits. And we have traced the shadows of folks on these particular days of the year, these particular days that have some relationship to the natural movements of the earth. So on the summer solstice, on the winter solstice, on the spring equinox and fall equinox, we have traced shadows of folks at different times. And those shadows have ended up in the pavements of Nicollet Mall, and most recently in Walker Arts Center, inscribed with the poems created by Soyini Guyton, letting folks know who was here before. And so at some point, you're able to stand in the shadows of all these folks who came before. And I say at some point, at these particular points in time, throughout our celestial year. So that was more than you asked for.
You are generous. I mean, I'm very much struck by, the idea of creating these markers that are both landmarks and sky marks and time marks and spirit marks, like these different, they set us into a place where we look at a kind of permanence in the face of the impermanence that's amplified by something like a chalk outline.
Right.
And a chalk outline is talking about a disappeared life, and erased life. And the chalk outline erases. Yeah. And these marks become something that you would have to destroy a part of the street again in order to remove them. In order to exhume these, you would have to, destroy a part of the street again, just as it was a part of that street was destroyed when the different people have been murdered. And I'm thinking about, the resonance of this, along, deaths, Breonna Taylor, like all of these, like all of these cities, all these sections of land and geography and geology that hold, where the blood has bled in, they hold this.
Right.
You talked about libation, which of course is another form of nourishment, right? You nourish the earth, you nourish your ancestors through that. Nourishing of community through quite literal means of food justice. All of those things come to mind as just different versions of bringing in food. You bring into a person and it transforms their body and it stays with them in different ways. And I guess what I would ask, and maybe it would be best to kind of, for me to proffer a set of definitions of memorial versus monument. This is something we talked about a little bit.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So like, I'm not consulting my Webster's at this moment, but I would put forth the idea that a monument, number one, assumes that someone's importance is already potentially permanent. Whereas a memorial is a call against forgetting, a call against erasure. And in that sense, like a memorial also is temporally locked. It has to happen after. Whereas a monument can happen during, people build monuments to themselves. There was a person, Donald Trump, I think his name is, who tries to erect monuments to himself all while he's still alive. And so I guess what I would wonder about is, can a monument also be, created retroactively after somebody has passed? And if so, what is the intentional distinction or the affective distinction between calling, say, something like what you've made for Philando Castile? Would you call it a monument? Would you call it a memorial? Would those terms even enter the space of your working with them?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a different answer to
that's fine.
This thing. We live in this time, and I'm fortunate that I've been around long enough to see terms kind of come and go. For a while, and every now and I see this again, this term muralism. And I knew at the time it was created that it wasn't gonna be around long, and it never really took on. It never took off. And unfortunately, in the English language, and you folks in the English department, this is the challenge out to you. We need to come up with, and just like you are really struggling with this difference between monument and memorial.
Yeah.
We don't have a word yet in the English language that I feel really describes not just what I do, but many other artists. One interdisciplinary artist that we know here locally is another Douglas Ewart.
Yes.
Douglas is a fantastic musician. He's also a brilliant sculptor. Now, what do you call Douglas? You know? I mean,
Douglas Ewart.
Yeah, exactly. We call him Douglas Ewart by his name, because he does this work that is really indefinable. We really don't have a word. And I can extend that out to many other African-American artists, visual artists in particular, who work in all these different disciplines and who have big community engagement components in their work. You know, shout out to Theaster Gates in Chicago, shout out to Rick Lowe in Houston, you know, and on and on and on. There are these artists that mix community with their work, and I've heard Rick Lowe describe it, use a term that really came from Joseph Beuys, calling it social sculpture. You know, so we grab like little bits and pieces from this rich context that we live in to come up with this stuff. And so like here, another term. I worked for a while for Walker Art Center in the education department. And there I helped start the community programs program there. And Addition helped start the teen program there. And that was at the height of museums exploring multiculturalism. and
exploring being a useful term.
Absolutely. and even the Weisman, you know, was exploring multiculturalism. And that's one of those terms that we no longer use. And it came and it went. And at some point, we're going to have a term to describe the work that we do. Right now, you know, among musicians, I mean, folks that come from the tradition that Douglas Ewart comes from don't necessarily call what the music they play jazz.
Right.
No, it is like this rich, from this rich Black tradition. Even Miles Davis at a particular point stopped calling it jazz, and because it is so much more than that. And I mean, that's a whole other discussion, but it's people, going back to what I was saying before about wanting to control my legacy, wanting to control what comes after me. It means also naming and saying, this is what this stuff is. And so to kind of answer your question, you know, I don't see a distinction for it. I mean, it's just like arguments that, the university scholar who just retired not too long ago, my dear friend John Wright, you know, who was the primary scholar around the Black arts movement, sometimes has trouble even dating the time and place of it. You know, I'm like one of those soldiers that was like way off in the jungle and fighting, and then somebody comes out and say, "Hey, the war is over." I said, "What? I didn't know." So I didn't know that the Black arts movement ended. I think, isn't it still happening now?
Like we weren't done, right? We didn't finish.
Right, exactly. Wait a minute, the revolution still hasn't happened yet.
No, it's all fixed now. You know.
Exactly. So it's all mixed up in all of that. You know, that kind of trying to make that distinction between monument and memorial. The work that Tacumba and I have done with Shadow Spirits and with Soyini is something that Tacumba is on a mission to take all over the world, as you mentioned, Breonna Taylor, and to do it in a way that it doesn't disappear like chalk in the rain.
Absolutely. Ooh, okay. I mean, So we have the person emerging from the jungle,
Yeah.
the soldier, and that's and one of the things that I think that's interesting about that in the context of the discussion we're having is that tension between recognizing where you are now, navigating the present moment, which, you know, the landmark helps you do. The landmark helps you. Oh, okay, this is where I am. But then thinking ahead to the impermanence and thinking about how will you be able to create a name in the same way that you would create a piece. But now this name actually has to encompass the piece so that we come in, whoever's coming after can look and go, oh, that's what that was, and understand it in something of the context that you intended, or at least, you know, built it within. And I think about the term social sculpture, and I think about that as behaving in a way that I find different than public art. The social sculpture to me feels like this thing that we fix ourselves around. It's a part of the conversation. And in fact, it's in some ways magnetic, as opposed to ornamental, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if we think about social and we take that the step forward to a sociality, right? What are the socialities that are created that necessitate this sculpture here? Right, that necessitate a half-mile long table. What does it allow to be charged within it? I'm thinking about something that Arthur Jafa said when he was describing the use of particularly Western Northern African sculpture when he was writing his piece My Black Death, and he was critiquing the work of people like Picasso,
right,
and how the sculptural object was not intended in the cultural context that he was referencing.
Absolutely.
To be viewed from one direction. It wasn't meant to be just rendered flat. And right. so that sense again of multiple dimensions. I'm trying to land this here, like multiple dimensions of breadth, depth, and width, but also being able to turn it and rotate it in your hands.
Right.
And so now I'm thinking about the archive as a material manifestation of work, of time. And I'm thinking about its placement. I'm thinking about it needing a language. I'm thinking about it needing its own design. And I guess if there is a question embedded in this some kind of way, I'm curious about how language for you is a tool, or collaborator, or an instrument. Let's say instrument. The language is an instrument for you in imagining how the past is preserved, how a legacy is preserved. How does language create a space for an intervention in that process as you work with collaborators or you work in your own speaking? Just, is that an interesting question at all?
Oh God, yeah. Yeah. And brother, you've asked some hard questions too. And that's allowed. That's allowed. I mean, this is a space where we can do that. And I'm so glad that I need to give a big shout out to the Weisman for having you do this interview, because this is like music as well. I mean, even listening to you ask the question and watching you move is all part of this grand Afro-Atlantic tradition as well. Yes, so, and language is embedded in that, and the way that we use language, the way that we move language along, and the way that we have transformed the way that we speak. You know, at some point in talking about naming, in thinking about this work for the University of Minnesota, in the English department, we even pose at some point whether or not the place that you work in, the department you work for, will still be called the English department. I mean, how will it be? I mean, so thinking ahead and thinking about powers of transformation. That's another little aside.
Mm-hmm.
But the, the archive, I should have also said that in talking about my legacy, I have witnessed the death of so many of my peers who have passed on without leaving instructions behind, over and over and over again. And their legacies, their work is scattered to the wind, sometimes deposited in dumpsters. And so, I'm creating this archive that I hope will be a template for other artists to use. Now, that will be embedded in this thing that we're calling the Black Gate. And this thing, once again, doesn't have a term that we can really describe it. And so I'm using these almost antiquated terms to describe this thing that is really part of this dynamic future that I still have hopes and desires for and am working toward. And so that archive will be a part of this new structure that will have a studio space, a commercial kitchen, and 2 apartments above it. So we're creating this mixed use structure that will hopefully be my new studio space that I will work in, up until I pass on. And then will become primarily a space for an artist in residence program that'll be based in Frogtown. This is going to be built on a vacant lot that my wife and I own that's literally 3 blocks away from where we live. And what I'm getting to when you talk about language and form is this will fit into the context of Frogtown. And it comments on the architectural vernacular of the neighborhood, but it also presents this point of departure. And so the designers, and I need to give them a big shout out. Once again, I talked about Formula, one of the only African-American led and owned architectural firms here in Minnesota. And they have come up with this space that will integrate art and text into the design. And so we're creating this artwork, and this has been a collaboration as well too. They've known me for a long time. They know my work. Folks have been in and out of my studio and know this vision. And so this thing will have this whole other life to it for a long time to come. So it will embody this rich philosophy and this grand African tradition of improvisation. And one of the partners of Formula wrote this paper years ago, and this is what blew my mind, and one of the things that really drew me to them, on hip-hop architecture. Now hip-hop architecture has become a thing, but he was one of the leading early proponents of that. And so once again, that musical frame helped create this thing. One of the things that we talked about all along the way was the spirit of Charlie Mingus. So that
bass too.
Once again, a bass player, and once again, this thing and this building will hopefully rock and move to this rhythm as well too that you're going to see in this over and over again. So yeah, I'm trying to describe even this sense of architectural space in this metaphor and this whole set of metaphors that relate to that magic, to the way that you use language, in your own work as well too. So like this is all part of that tradition.
I mean, you know, and we're about to turn to audience Q&A, but but something that just came to mind, you know, calling the place, you know, naming the place that can't be named Black Gate.
Yeah.
And it just reminds me of Yoruban traditions, where the keeper of the gate, you know, Esholevara, right, is a site not only of improvisation and interpretation, but a place of meeting, and it's where you encounter the Black codes, right? And so that to me is something that's just really very resonant. You know, I feel greedy right now because I'm like looking down at the Q&A. I'm like, man, I asked these questions, but I bet these questions are going to be absolutely powerfully rich. We have one statement. Was it Sterling Brown, speechwriter, you were thinking about?
You know, I see that question, and that comes from our dear old friend Herman Milligan, who is one of our grand art patrons here in the city. But I don't think it's Sterling Brown. Sterling Brown was a poet, and and I still can't remember the brother's name. Yeah. But we'll talk about that, Herman. Give me a shout out.
Excellent. And so, you know, we have some other questions that I'll go to. Let's see here. So this is informative information to me. I recently participated in the Art for All Stephanie Ivelo solo show, which was inside Pillsbury Hall. Did you discover anything related to that organization at Pillsbury, to the organization at Pillsbury?
No, this is also coming from another friend / artist, Donna Ray, a great sculptor in clay. But no, I didn't find anything related to that. But you know, we'll have to dig that up, Donna.
And Donna goes on to ask, I believe very much in keeping and remembering historical facts about humanity, its places marked in the ecosystem. Where do we sit within the entire ecosystem?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I haven't talked about is the role that ecological humility plays. I did mention that. And when I talked about how indigenous folks have not tried to master or to conquer or to dominate the natural order of things, but have worked with it and have sometimes attempt to manage it. But that's all part of this ecological humility too. We can't control, we can't take over. And all of that leads to all the extractive methods of mining resources from the environment, that and having no kind of relationship and thinking about our children and our grandchildren. So, I mean, that's all part of and I see you're asking about humility, but it's all part of the way I approach my work in the environment. I really haven't talked about that in detail, but the role of humility.
And then Donna Ray gives us another couple of questions here that I think are very important.
Absolutely.
As an African-American disabled female artist, I believe it's important not to forget the ladies out here. Where do women fit in with their artistic disciplines? Who are some of the artists, you've talked about, your partner, Sugini,
right.
Who are some of the other women, not only who may or may not have influenced you or worked with you, but are doing work that we could take this moment and this access to our privilege to amplify?
No, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Donna. You know, like and challenge me. That is, I need to even sometimes correct myself, and my wife will correct me many times as well. And I did mention my wife and the role that she has played as one of my most important collaborators. But, there were a whole set of women artists that also, and I didn't give you a lot of names of the folks that were a part of Inner City Youth League, but there were these women artists too that were my peers whose work has been erased. Thinking about the work of Katana Day, the work of Maria Kafels, seeing their work was a big inspiration for me. And then, the work by all of these artists out here who work in other mediums. Part of the inspiration for creating this legacy is the relationship I had over a couple of decades with the artist who's passed, Lori Carlos. Who was a fantastic playwright, artist, and once again creating work along that line that is hard to define. What did they call for colored girls when a choreo poem?
Choreo poem, yeah.
Because we didn't have a name to really describe what was on stage there. But anyways, no, thank you again for challenging me, for pushing me.
Thank you. All right, Corey from Frogtown Farm. Keanu told me you saw Fela Kuti play. What was that like? And what was that like? What was it like seeing?
This is where, because I was so deep into music, this is where I really do feel like an old timer. I tell folks that, I was able to see Bob Marley perform, Jimi Hendrix, Nina Simone, all of these folks that were Duke Ellington, Miles Davis. And one person I saw in Lagos at the place that he called Africa Shrine was Fela Kuti, who played what he felt was in the style of James Brown, but he created this whole musical genre. That's where Afrobeat really began in the early 70s, late 60s with Fela Kuti in Lagos in Nigeria. Africa Shrine, and also the politics of the time. Africa Shrine was, he declared independence from Lagos, independence from Nigeria, in creating this new country that was based on equality. Now, there are these stories, sometimes horror stories, of what happened in Africa Shrine. But I did see Fela Kuti perform. Saw him perform actually with Ginger Baker, a member of the Cream, white rock musician who also spent a lot of time in Lagos. So I could sit and tell you like these old timer stories too, but it was inspiring, and another one of those things that helped me develop.
Excellent. And thank you for the kind words as well, Corey. I want to presence what Makeda Zulu Gillespie. Makeda is saying, no question, just love for the elders, artists, leaders making change and acknowledging the past, giving life in the present, leaving a legacy and making our ancestors proud. Thank you.
And I can't tell you, almost now it moves me to tears to hear that from Makeda, who I saw grow up. Her parents are these fantastic artists who enshrined, almost in a very formal way, Black storytelling. They were the leading proponents and organizers of that, of this whole movement for Black storytellers, holding an annual event. I mean, one of the best parts of their events was the Liars Contest, also in this grand African tradition. But she talks about making our ancestors proud. I can't tell you how proud we are of folks in the generation that followed us, like Makeda, have gone on to these leadership roles. And I should say that Makeda is now I think the director of the Urban Research Outreach Center in North Minneapolis, another part of our legacy.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that, Makeda. I'm thinking about, something you were saying earlier, just a brief interruption of the flow of Q&A, about the urgency of preserving the archive, especially the archive that takes place outside of, established I don't want to say established, I want to say particular kinds of institution, oftentimes white institutions or moneyed institutions, which are oftentimes synonymous. And that was Wanda Coleman, the poet Wanda Coleman, who was very important to me understanding the need for gathering what the term is often ephemera, like posters, broadsides, flyers. You spoke about hip hop architecture earlier. I'm just thinking about all of the things that belong to the classification of vernacular or folk, right? And what that does in terms of its relationship to notions of the archive, and theorists and writers right now, ranging from Saidiya Hartman to Sylvia Winters, to all of these Hortense Spillers who are engaging the archive in these ways that are oftentimes not only deeply robust in their academic approach, but oftentimes interdisciplinary as well. Mm-hmm. And so just really thinking about archiving and the moment of talking about Black archive right now, there's just a lot of people critically engaging that. Even as you were saying, questioning what we call the English department, like what do we call it? Is it an archive? So it's just something I wanted to just throw out there.
No, you're right on. I was trying to, in talking with you the other day, and I still now, another name I can't remember is the name of the author of an article that appeared in the New York Times just last week, where in her first 2 paragraphs of the article, she was talking about this book that she had wrote, where she was trying to find the origins of a bag, a cloth bag, that was used to store clothes, or to have clothes and some food in it, that was passed on from a mother to her daughter, who was being sold away. They never saw each other again. And that bag was passed down in the family. And 2 generations back, or 2 generations from that, one of the grandkids of the woman that was sold away sewed this inscription into the bag, describing what had happened and what the bag held.
Tia Miles, right? It's Tia
Yeah,
Miles.
that's right. That's right. And yeah, you got it. This historian at Harvard University, and she. And so she was trying to track that down, because that bag ended up in a flea market. And if the person hadn't bought it for $5 and then brought it to folks' attention, we wouldn't have that memory. And in the first 2 paragraphs of this article, where she describes this process of trying to find out what happened to the family and why that piece ended up in a flea market, she talked about archive and what it meant. I mean, the word itself. and all the weight that goes along with it. Generally, and she talks about this, the folks who establish archives are rich white men. Not even women will have their own archives that are dedicated to them. And it's only rich white men who have been allowed the luxury of thinking about what's going to happen to their stuff and what's going to happen to their legacy. So that is something we need to question. Maybe we'll have another word for archive as well there. You know, so yeah, it is something that that we're going to be constantly teasing throughout the time that we're creating the Black Gate.
So we've got a couple of other questions here.
Okay, I'll try and answer these quick because we don't have too much time.
Oh no, a couple of these are fact checking.
Okay, good.
Carolyn Holbrook asks, there was the quote that you gave from Sterling, whose last name we're trying to get together. Exactly. What was that quote one more time?
It was shorter than I think. I confused folks. It was really just stories nurture us. And so those stories, and he went on to talk about, and I just am paraphrasing from that, but the exact quote is that stories nurture us. But he went on to paraphrase to talk about how those stories feed us, feed our desire to know about what happened before, and will inform folks for what's going to happen after.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Carolyn, for bringing that back up for us.
Yeah, big shout for another writer out there, Carolyn Holbrook.
Mm-hmm. The Carolyn Holbrook.
That's right. You need to have somebody like her on this as well, too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, when I first lived here, you know, Carolyn Holbrook's name was the name for poetry and just communities organizing of communities of poets writing. You know, people have a long time had this tried to argue about the split between page and stage, and I just feel like Carolyn kind of obviates that idea of a split. So I
hear
think,
you.
Yeah, there's.
I hear you. Oh, you know, another point, and I need to bring this up. My wife just texted me another thing I need to remember, and that is not thing, but another person, and that is the role that Rafala Green had here in creating public work and really leading the way for a number of African-American artists. Also a point of inspiration to me, to both of us. Rafala created a sculpture that is still standing, that is very organic and rich, working with the nature and natural environment around her on the corner of Chicago and Franklin. So when you go by that piece and look at that, that is a piece that was created by Rafala Green, who unfortunately doesn't have an archive and had a rich collection of work that went back 30 years before she moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul. Anyway, so that's another little side. Thank you, Soyini.
All right, we're still in the lightning round. We got 10 minutes. We're going to do this.
All right, cool.
So Arlita Little asks, hey, Seitu, thank you for being such a library of Black art and culture in our community. I'm thinking about the deep and demanding work of so many artists like you who combine artistic practice, organizing, and institution building. So many of us folk get tired. What keeps you going? How do you restore your soul and take care of yourself?
Well, Arlita, and I also need to give a big shout out to Arlita, who has been a grand patron too for so many artists. Arlita leads the McKnight Fellowships programs at the McKnight Foundation and has been a patron to so many of us. But Arlita, I'm outing myself again. I am tired. I am weary. I mean, that's
I am
part of the exactly. Yeah, we're gonna break into song after that, but and then say amen afterward. But yeah, I have. I am tired. And that's part of the reason why I'm planning this next season of my life. And consciously, very consciously, and with intention, and I didn't mention this at all, but a big part of my work is passing on information, knowledge, and culture to the artists that are coming behind me. And so in terms of restoring my soul, I have been spending less time doing a lot of work outside my studio and more time hanging with plants and nature. And that's a whole other story, and where I can talk on and on about one of my great grandfathers of inspiration, and that's George Washington Carver. One thing I will say is that Carver, we all know him and the work he did as a botanist. Actually, one of America's greatest botanists is George Washington Carver, but not many folks know that he was also a visual artist and never stopped making art along the whole time. So part of it is digging deeper into the role that plants play in our environment.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I'm going to throw another. We have spoken to the community, and the community has spoken back. Is it Sterling Tucker?
You know, it might be, but I gotta look that up. Yeah, you know, my poor mind. Now I've confused the entire world out.
No. This is the community coming together. You're convening.
Yeah, so I'm gonna really ask folks to do that digging. I mean, you might even want to just Google stories nourish us. This brother, oh God, he was interviewed by Krista Tippett on Being years ago, and it was one of the interviews that I played over and over for a while. So those are all these clues that are out there.
All right. Okay. Hannah Jo King is asking, well, first says, this talk is amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to go back to what Seitu said about working with light and shadows. What have you learned from light, or what is light saying to you? In the same way as we talk about material.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is one of these other things that is very, you mentioned the word ephemeral, that comes and goes, that can point the way. And that's the way that Tecumseh and I have always looked and talked about these shadows. And the text that Soyini has created also responds to that, is that it can point the way for us or point away from something. And so it is this magic, and one of these things that indigenous folks consciously worked with. It was a way of keeping time. And this is a way of keeping time with the entire universe.
Fantastic. Well, we might be able to pull this off, folks. All right. So we have tiny question from Lisa Hintz. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. What does Afro-Atlantic mean?
Oh, yeah, that is part of this grand tradition of Black folks on both sides of the Atlantic. Culture that came from Africa, unfortunately, by way of the slave trade, and planted roots in South America, the Caribbean, and North America. So there are these Africanisms that appear, that jump out in us. There are these traditions in the culinary arts, the visual arts, the music as well, and language that we talked about, all these carryovers. And that is what I call the Afro-Atlantic tradition. And really, I say I call it, but that was a term that I really first heard from Robert F. Thompson, art historian at Yale, who inspired a number of African-American artists in my generation.
All right. From Christine Baumler.
Christine Baumler.
Baumler. All right. Okay. Thank you. That was me trying to flex some German or something. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, Seitu. Seitu, you've had such an impact with Capital Region Watershed District as a long-term member on the board of managers. You've had such an impact and legacy on how we think about water, our perception of water, and how the arts can be integrated into work with water in St. Paul and beyond. Your work has been so transformational in so many significant ways, some of which are not materially based. Just wanted to acknowledge that contribution as well. So.
Thank you, Christine. And Christine, also somebody I needed to give a big shout out to. When she first moved here, and I'm not going to say how many years ago that was, because she always corrects me, but Christine is now the chair of the art department at the University of Minnesota, and was one of the folks that has carried through and pushed through the role of engagement and how it plays a role in the art. And so what she is acknowledging is the work that I've attempted to do with Capital Region Watershed District as on the board of that, to help create policies that integrate art into the public infrastructure.
All right. Stephanie Allen, Seitu, as you design and formulate your powerful legacy, are you including plans for how your archive and legacy can be amplified?
Yeah, I mean, what I am attempting to do, and big shout out to Stephanie in California. All these friends are calling it Stephanie. But in answer to your question, Stephanie, yes. I hope what I'm doing will become a template that other artists can use, other artists can steal, other artists can use as a way to prevent erasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Herman Milligan asks, if time permits, we got about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. Can Seitu talk about the efforts he and Takumba made to establish the first African-American cultural center in Minneapolis in the 1970s?
Yeah, damn, Herman. This is another one of these questions from Herman, who was around during that time period. But yeah, that's one that we'll have to do a separate thing about, because that really helped form and was Takumba Aiken and my organizational connection to the Black arts movement and so many other artists. But yeah, Herman, we'll have to spend some more time talking about it. And actually, and I see our leader posted something too, because this is a conversation that she's been wanting to have.
Excellent. Well, I'm scanning the rest of the Q&A, and I want to amplify the really wonderful things people have been saying. Sage Carroll, another multi-disciplinary,
that's right,
community nourishing artist. Mm-hmm. She says, so good to hear the two of you talking. This is the nourishment. Thank you, thank you. Tom Borup asks, this has been brilliant as another old timer. So glad I stayed up for this. Right? with a smile.
Big shout out to Tom. Big shout out to Sage. Congratulations, Sage, too. Sage just got her MFA from the University of Minnesota.
Master of Fine Arts.
Right.
That's right. And I'm going to just leave this question in the air because it's maybe it's a quick thing that you could feel like you could answer. But if not, I think I remember something you said and I'll throw it in there. But Cynthia Gehrig asks, is gardening an art form for you? What role does it play for you?
2 words. Hell yeah.
And I'll add 2 words, mic drop.
Thank you, Cynthia, another grand patron of mine.
Well, I want to thank you all for these questions. for listening and for sticking around, for the time you took to amplify certain things and to challenge and just to engage us. I also want to thank the Weisman for pairing me with you, Seitu. This has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to many more conversations, some of which might not be recorded.
Hopefully not.
right. But thank you all so much for joining us. There might be a little coda put on, but I just wanted to say thank you all from me reporting live from Rondo.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you so much, Seitu, and thank you everyone in the audience for holding space with us tonight. This was such a powerful conversation that I feel could go on for another hour or so. So we'll just say to be continued. You all will get a survey, and we would love it if you would fill it out and give us some feedback so we can continue hosting programs like this. Thank you all so much, and until next time, take care.